Thank you so much, Lynn. It's lovely to be here. Lovely to see all these faces here in the room and all the people who are here on Zoom as well. I'm going to see if I can do this properly. I can probably do two things at the same time, but I'm not sure about three. There we go. There we go. So welcome, all of you. First things first, I'd like to be clear here, I'm not an expert when it comes to Parkinson's disease. There's a good chance that there are a few people here in the audience or in the audience at home who know more about Parkinson's than I do. And I'm not an expert in literary translation either. Over the past 20 years, I've done all sorts of translation for various organizations, mostly cultural organizations, social community organizations. But this is my first literary translation and one published by a bona fide publishing house. What I'm going to talk about mostly is how and why I came to translate this particular book and what this experience has been like and what I learned along the way. It all started when I read a very positive review in Le Devoir of this book here. Let's see if I can get it up on the screen. Does that work? It did work. Excellent. This book is called À vos ordres, Colonel Parkinson by François Gravel. For a while, I'd been playing with the idea of doing some literary translation. I thought, maybe I'll read this book, and if I like it, maybe I'll try translating it. I bought the book, and I absolutely loved its wry and witty tone, the way François Gravel is able to impart some very serious information, but with a very light touch. To be quite honest, I also liked the fact that it was a short book. For my first serious literary translation, I didn't want to bite off more than I could chew. Who is François Gravel? Well, before he became a writer, and I think he kind of overlapped, he was probably teaching economics at the same time as he was writing books. He's written over 100 books, many award-winning books for children. My son, when he was young, read and loved the Clonk series. There are a number of books in the Clonk series. Hold on, I'll show you a picture of François Gravel. There he is. And here are some of his books for children. There's the Clonk. He's got the first one, Clonk, then I think it's called Clonk contre Clonk, and then Clonk et le Beetle mouillé, Beetle as in John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Here's another book. He often stars in his books. This one's called François joue au hockey, and there's a whole series, François fait ci, François fait ça. Here's another one called Le Livre Noir sur la vie secrète des animaux, the Black Book on the Secret Life of Animals. This one is about vacations, and that's another series as well. Here's one called Comment je suis devenu cannibale, and I think it's for young readers as well, maybe for not for children, but for teenagers, and it's about writing. He's got a lot of books that are about writing itself. This one's called Schlick. I think there's a book on his head, and I think that one's about writing too. This one is called Les vieux livres sont dangereux. Old books are dangerous. But he's also written more than 20 novels and nonfiction books for adults, 5 of which have been translated into English by Sheila Fishman. So there's one called Adieu, Betty Crocker. It's called that in English too, Adieu, Betty Crocker. Ostende, you're seeing the French cover here. Benito and Felicity's Fool. So they may even be available at the Atwater Library. I haven't checked. Just so you know, his daughter, Elise Gravel, is also a children's writer, as is his wife, I believe. But his daughter is an extremely successful children's writer. She's written this book, The Worst Book Ever. But I don't think it's that bad. And she's written many, many books as well. His latest book is a work of nonfiction called Le Deuxième Verre, The Second Glass. And it looks at Quebec of the 1950s, the culture of drinking, and I'm referring to alcohol here, and the society that tolerated it. François Gravel grew up with a father and I think 4 or 5 uncles who were all committed drinkers. which certainly took its toll on them. And if you read this book, you'll discover that it also took its toll on François Gravel, having a father who was an alcoholic, and his brother was too, I believe. So back to à vos ordres, Colonel Parkinson. In the mid-60s, François Gravel, when he was in his mid-60s, he learned that he had Parkinson's disease, and he wrote this book about it. Why did I want to translate a book about Parkinson's disease? I do have a friend who I have since discovered has Parkinson's disease. She lives out west. And I have also just learned that an uncle, my uncle Arthur, who I remember as a drinker of Crown Royal and a smoker of cigars, I learned, he's no longer alive, but I learned that he had Parkinson's at the end of his life, which I didn't realize at the time. But mainly the brother of my closest friend, Maria, has a very serious form of Parkinson's disease. He's had it for about 18 years. And Maria lives in Toronto. She's originally from Ireland. Her brother still lives in Ireland. And virtually every day, I talk to Maria almost every day. And she tells me very often what his life has been like, what he's been going through living with Parkinson's. So I thought, kind of as an homage to them, to Maria and to her brother Declan, that I would like to translate this book for them, kind of an homage to them and to their resilience, but also to make it available to English readers, to other people with Parkinson's, and to their families. So I bought the book. I remember I bought it at Librairie Gallimard on Rue Saint-Laurent, and took it home and set about translating a couple of chapters. Then I set it aside because I really didn't know what to do next. How do I go about finding a publisher? Many months later, I took a translation workshop through the Quebec Writers Federation, which has their office right down the hall here. And the workshop, though it was on Zoom because it was during the pandemic, the workshop was led by translator Jonathan Kaplansky, who happens to be in this room. Hi, Jonathan. Thank you for coming. And in this workshop, each of us had to present a translation project. So I presented my 2 chapters of Colonel Parkinson, and Jonathan was very encouraging, and he said, you should pitch this book to a publisher. Now, I'll explain here what I know about how books get translated. As I understand it, there are 2 basic ways. What often happens is that the publisher takes one of their books, one that they think will sell well in another language, and goes to a book fair, maybe a Salon du Livre or the famous huge Frankfurt book fair, and they meet up with publishers who work in another language, and they pitch the book to them. And then if the publisher decides, the foreign language publisher decides to buy the rights, they then hire their own translator, and that person gets to work on the book. The other way is that a translator, someone like Jonathan or someone like me who's just starting out, reads a book, for example, in French, loves it, and decides to pitch it to an English language publisher. And I think this happens quite frequently here in Quebec and in Canada because the literary community is a very close-knit one, and all the publishers and translators pretty much know each other. Might be exaggerating a little, but not too much. So what Jonathan explained to us in this workshop was how to pitch a book translation. First, you contact the original French language publisher, and you ask if the English language rights to the book are available. If they are, then you proceed. You write a letter of introduction. You explain why it's absolutely essential to publish this book. You submit a couple of chapters that you've translated. You include some reviews of the book. You include the author's bio and your own. And then you wait and wait and wait. After several months go by, you might start to get emails rejecting your proposal. Though if you're a well-known translator and you've already published several translations, your proposal might get snapped up. I think that's what happens with Jonathan. He's smiling. Not always. My case was a little bit different. In literary translation, I was a totally unknown quantity. So first I contacted the French language publisher, Quebec Amérique. We're still with this book. The person in charge of rights, Alexandra Valiquette, she told me the rights to À vos ordres, Colonel Parkinson were still available. But I think she realized pretty quickly that I was really a newbie when it came to pitching translations, and she offered to help me. She also told me that her grandfather had had Parkinson's. So Alexandra and I, working together, picked 5 or 6 publishers to pitch the translation to. I wrote to a couple of them, she wrote to a couple of them, but no one bid. Then I sent my pitch to House of Anansi, which is a very well-respected independent Canadian publisher. They were based in Toronto. Now, I don't remember whether he called me or I called him, but somehow I ended up on the phone talking to Bruce Walsh, who had recently become the publisher at House of Anansi Press. Bruce had lived in Montreal for about 10 years, and he'd worked at McGill Queen's University Press. And he remembered me from then because, like Lynn, he listened to CBC Radio, and I was a host there. And he said to me, "Oh, I was a fan of yours." And then he told me he really liked the tone of the chapters that I'd sent him, the 2 chapters that I translated. He also told me that he had a neurological disease, though he didn't say which disease it was or how long he'd had it. Then he said, "I'll take the book." Well, I really couldn't believe my ears. This is House of Anansi Press, like this esteemed publisher, and I'm the newbie, right? So I kind of stuttered and stammered a little bit. And I said, "Well, you know, I'm waiting to hear back from a couple of other publishers." And he said to me, "Well, you call them up and tell them you have a publisher." He says, "I'm going to publish it." And I got off the phone. I was in absolute shock. So here we go. We get to this book. Now, what I learned only very recently is that the week that I sent my pitch to Bruce Walsh, he just received a diagnosis of a neurological condition called ataxia. And recently, when the English translation of Colonel Parkinson in Charge was published, Bruce posted this on social media. And I'll read it to you what he wrote. "Shortly after arriving at Anansi, I was diagnosed with ataxia. I began looking for books on the subject and was coming up with snake eyes when Shelley Pomerance got in touch." I'm extremely naive. I did not know what snake eyes meant. Snake eyes, I have discovered, is a gambling expression, which means very little, or as they say in Yiddish, bubkas. So would I be interested in Bruce goes on, would I be interested in a translation she was working on? Shelley Pomerance asked me, a memoir of living with Parkinson's. He wrote, "People with Parkinson's or ALS have problems with gait, balance, speech, swallowing, and so on, all manifestations of ataxia, which these diseases bring on. I'm lucky, as I have neither disease, neither Parkinson's nor ALS. And there have been no changes to my condition since initial diagnosis. But this was a book I wanted to read." And here I am, end of quote from Bruce Walsh. So I had a publisher. Unfortunately, several months after he arrived at Anansi and soon after he accepted my translation, Bruce left his job there because he went to look after himself, look after his health. But we have stayed in touch, and recently I took a workshop with him, another QWF workshop, on how to pitch a book to publishers. He's been very supportive all along, encouraging me to get out there and promote Colonel Parkinson's, which is one of the reasons I'm here. And he's been spreading the word about it himself. But to get back to the translation, I should explain that I didn't exactly work on this all on my own. I had 2 people helping me on the first draft. For years, my friend Maria, whose brother has Parkinson's, she's my corrector. She's my second reader. Everything I write, everything I translate, she reads and corrects. And as I worked on this translation, she went through each chapter of the book, making suggestions and improvements. Also, I happen to live with a Francophone, which is a very useful thing if you're a translator. He went through the translation as well, and he compared every sentence with the French to make sure I got all the nuances just right. Then, when the first draft was done, I sent it off to my editor at House of Anansi Press, Siobhan Hearn. And then she did a very detailed edit, pointing out all the inconsistencies, mistakes, mine, not François Gravel's, extraneous words and punctuation, and making it more precise. Comments like, "There are some instances of very short paragraphs that can feel a little choppy. Please review those instances where I've removed a paragraph break." Those paragraphs didn't feel choppy in the original French, but she was right. When I put them into English, they didn't necessarily flow properly. Then Siobhan passed the manuscript along to a copy editor, Sue Semerage, who went at it tooth and nail, doing an even more detailed edit, further improving the grammar, the sentence structure, making it read more smoothly. But she also asked some very picky and intelligent questions, including some scientific ones. She goes, so is it already dopamine when it reaches the brain, or does it remain levodopa until it crosses the blood-brain barrier, at which point it is converted to dopamine? Of course, I did not know the answer. By the way, I don't know this woman, Sue Semerage. I only ever saw her name on paper, but I've looked at her Facebook page recently, and she is obviously a very serious bird watcher. She takes the most amazing photos of birds, and if there weren't copyright problems, I would have shown you some here. So you can look her up. So Siobhan and Sue made literally hundreds of corrections, some very small, some not so small, to the manuscript. It's amazing how mistakes sneak in there when you're translating. Now I will sneak in a little sip of water. In a passage about how good or not so good his reflexes are, François Gravel wrote that he would probably avoid taking part in a duel in the Wild West. The two editors questioned whether it should be a pistol fight, a gunfight, a pistol duel. They nearly had a duel themselves over which one to use. When Gravel uses the word voilà in the French version, I kept the word in the English translation. Sue, the copy editor, wrote, as per Canadian Oxford, no accent on voilà in English. Although we could stet this, in editor's language, stet means leave as is. Although we could stet this if the author objects, which would be understandable, I elected to keep the accent. A few times I had to push back. There were instances when the editors were a bit too politically correct to my liking, or to François Gravel's liking, because occasionally I would check with him on things. The editors are in Toronto. We're not, and like it or not, it's a different culture. I don't know if you ever read a book. If you're like me, you read a book and you find it too long, too meandering, full of typos, and wonder if it was edited at all. That happens to me all too frequently. But my experience with this book was the opposite. I was so fortunate to have all these wonderful editors, the unofficial ones and the official ones, going over my translation with a fine-tooth comb, or I should say 4 fine-teethed comb. I hope it shows in the final product. Now, a little bit about the contents of the book. Not too much because I don't want to spoil it for you, but in case you plan to read it, but just enough to tempt you to borrow it from the library or to buy it. Why did François Gravel write a book about Parkinson's disease? Well, as he says, there's no cure, but for him, writing is a remedy. And I'm quoting him here. It seems to forestall the inevitable decline, and it feels good to air one's problems. A couple of other quotes. For a long time, I believed that Parkinson's was a disease. Now I realize it's a philosophy course. And when you have a degenerative disease, you know for certain you'll never recover. So you tell yourself to enjoy how you're feeling today, because it could be worse tomorrow. I think also that he hopes this book will be of help to anyone who has just received a diagnosis of Parkinson's, or their friends and members of their family. At the very least, it will provide them with some information, and there's a very good chance it will also make them smile. I think it takes an unusual and special person to be able to write about a disease like Parkinson's and their own medical condition in such a philosophical and humorous light as he does. And if I could turn the pages, there we go. All right, now I'm finally going to get you onto something else here. If you have a look at the book, and there are some at the back, you'll notice that the chapter headings are in an unusual typeface. It's called Shake, and it was designed by someone whose mother has Parkinson's. And I don't know if the designer was a man or a woman because they're not identified on the website. They used their mother's handwriting to create this typeface and to raise awareness and to raise funds for research. So there's a whole website devoted to Shake. and it's called Write with Parkinson's, all is one word.com. And that's the person's mother. For some reason, I think it's a woman who invented this typeface. I don't know why I think that, but that's their mother. And they're examples of this woman's handwriting. And I believe what the person who created the typeface, the graphic designer, is hoping to do is, as the condition degenerates, every year there'll be a new version of the typeface. But so far, there are only two versions that I've seen online, 2019 and 2020, I believe. In the book, François Gravel gives the reader some history of the disease and the doctors who first identified it, in particular, James Parkinson. These are two images of James Parkinson. You'll notice the one on the top is the one that appears on the cover French book. But in fact, neither of these photographs are of James Parkinson. James Parkinson died in 1824, and photography was invented in 1826. So it's not possible. I mean, most often the person on the top there is credited as being James Parkinson, but then I found this photograph of another person who's identified as James Parkinson. But François Gravel explains that this person here on the top, his name was actually James, I think it's pronounced Cumine Parkinson. He was an Irishman. He was in the Navy for a while, and then he went off to Australia to do something much more productive. He went off to search for gold. But as I mentioned, James Parkinson, the doctor, had died in 1824, and photography wasn't invented until 1826. So that's two photographs of, as I call them, not James Parkinson. Now, why does François Gravel call the disease Colonel Parkinson? And I will read to you directly from my translation to explain. He writes, I like the idea that the main character in our story is faceless. We can depict him as we wish. My personal Parkinson has a mustache, beard, and sideburns, as in the photograph. But I have, and you'll see back here, I have assigned him the rank of colonel in an imaginary army and have dressed him in a uniform befitting his title, with an abundance of medals and gold braid, not to mention protuberant epaulettes on his shoulders. When I don't feel up to my morning jog, I hear him shouting so loudly that I'm obliged to obey. I no longer have any choice in the matter. He's already in charge. Gravel also tells us that James Parkinson, who identified the disease, he identified the disease basing this only on observing 6 patients. The first 3 were in his office, 2 others were on the street, and as for the 6th, he observed him only from a distance. Certain sources go so far as to claim that he gave only one of them a physical exam, which sounds like visits to the doctors today. If you get to see them in person and not on Zoom, they might not even touch you. He writes about the daily frustrations of living with Parkinson's, the complications of brushing his teeth, trouble getting his wallet out of his back pocket. And he says it's not just because he's stingy. Playing Scrabble and manipulating all those pesky little tiles, putting his key in a lock or putting a plug in a socket. He discusses a number of famous individuals who were thought to have Parkinson's, but didn't. For example, Charles Schulz, the inventor of peanuts, the creator of peanuts, he didn't have Parkinson's. He had essential tremor. Johnny Cash, most likely he didn't have Parkinson's, but some other neurodegenerative disease. François Gravel attributes Johnny Cash's illness to alcohol, a combination of alcohol pills and grief over the loss of his wife, June Carter. John Diefenbaker, he had essential tremor. By the way, I have a hairdresser who has essential tremor. It's kind of amazing. He's an amazing hairdresser, but while he's cutting, you can see his hand trembles a little bit. And then Muhammad Ali, well, he probably didn't have Parkinson's. He had probably boxer's dementia. And then there are a number of celebrities who we know of who do or did have Parkinson's disease. Deborah Kerr, Alan Alda, Linda Ronstadt, Janet Reno, Michael J. Fox, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Billy Graham, Pope John Paul II, and a couple of artists in here, Salvador Dali and Norval Morisseau. He does also have a chapter called The Dictator's Disease. Hitler probably did have Parkinson's, aside from a few other problems. Francisco Franco had Parkinson's and a number of other afflictions. And Mao Zedong, he was thought to have had it, though he had syphilis, he had strokes, and probably he had ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, rather than Parkinson's. We won't stick around with Mao for too long. Let me change the image there. I've never met François Gravel, but we have communicated by mail. And while I was translating the book, I had the occasional question for him and he'd answer me. Then once he'd seen the final draft, and I think he approved of it, then he wrote much more often. In one email, he explained to me that he has a particular affection for British humor and identifies more with it than with French humor, what the French call esprit, he explained to me, which is sort of a more sardonic form of wit, which he says isn't really all that funny. He's funny even when he's talking about being funny. Now, a few challenges I encountered while translating Colonel Parkinson. François Gravel includes several songs in his book. There's a verse of a song by Leonard Cohen called Slow, and a few lines from the Beatles' Let It Be, and a song called Le Testament by Georges Brassens. Well, my editor told me I couldn't include lyrics from these songs unless I had the rights to use them, which in the case of Let It Be and Slow meant applying to the agency that holds the rights. I contacted the agency and learned that I would have had to fork over $500 out of my own pocket for one verse of the Leonard Cohen song, and probably at least as much for a couple of lines of Let It Be. English Canadian publishers are very law-abiding. So I couldn't just throw the, I think the French publishers are more relaxed and they let you quote songs freely, but not English Canadian publishers. Fortunately, a kind and generous soul named Tom Thompson had translated the Brassens song and posted it online, mentioning that anyone could use his translation as long as he was given credit for it, which I gladly did. So what did I do about the Leonard Cohen and Beatles songs? I did not have an extra $1,000 hanging around to pay for the rights. That would have taken a very large chunk of what I actually earned for the translation. So my editor said, well, just paraphrase those verses. And reluctantly, that's what I did. Not a perfect solution, but a compromise. And isn't that what life is about, compromise? So I do suspect that François Gravel is a diehard Beatles fan, and there are clues, he leaves clues here and there. A couple of weeks ago, I sent him some information about a podcast on Parkinson's disease. It's called Movers and Shakers. And it's being produced in the UK by a group of people who have the disease. And the group includes some very prestigious, prominent people, journalists, communication specialists, and a judge. This judge was at one point Britain's top divorce lawyer, and he represented Sir Paul McCartney in his famous divorce. So François wrote back, so I'm connected to Paul McCartney. And I replied, a bit sardonically myself, yes, through a divorce. Should I congratulate you? Bien sûr, he replied, mais je préférais John Lennon. Colonel Parkinson in Charge was published in March. A couple of weeks ago, the Toronto Star published an entire chapter from the book. They mentioned the author. They printed a nice big photo of him in one of the book cover, though they forgot to mention yours truly, the translator. I wrote to Jonathan Kaplansky, and he said, buck up your courage. I called the publicist at Anansi. She said she'd see what they could do. The next thing I knew, My name had been added in very small print right at the end of the excerpt online, not the print version, unfortunately. When I negotiated my contract with Anansi, I asked to have my name on the cover, but they said never put the translator's name. They never put the translator's name on the cover. You'll notice some publishers do put the translator's name on the cover, some don't. However, when I was sent a proof of the cover before publication, lo and behold, there was my name. I might have to go back and I'll show you after. And not in tiny type either, in very respectable type. I think at some point between the time I signed my contract and the time the book came out, they had changed their policy. Literary translation is a labor of love. Very often the translator's name, as I mentioned, doesn't appear on the cover, though lately there have been a number of articles in the New York Times, in The Guardian, in other newspapers, just about this very subject. Translators saying we really should have our names on the cover. It's another form of writing. Literary translators spend hours and hours working on a text. It's an extremely long and meticulous process, even when it's a short book. And that's something you might think about next time you read a work in translation. So far, there have been a few reviews of Colonel Parkinson in Charge, including one from Good Morning America. And that's what you're seeing here. That's called 13 Books to Spring into Reading This March. House of Anansi's publicist was very happy about that. This review, it's very short, one little paragraph, and I'll read it to you in a minute. It appeared in a blog by someone named Zibby Owens. She's like the Martha Stewart of the book world. She's kind of a corporation unto herself. She has a blog, a podcast, a newsletter, a magazine, a bookstore, a book club, retreats, and more, all devoted just to books. She also, a little aside here, has a billionaire father who's a buddy of Donald Trump's. I was quite dismayed to learn this, and who for a few months was chairman of the White House Strategic and Policy Forum under Donald Trump. He donated a mere $15 million to the Senate Leadership Fund, which is a super PAC tied to Mitch McConnell. But let's not go there. Let's talk about his daughter Zibby instead. Zibby Owens, or one of her minions, had some very nice things to say about Colonel Parkinson in Charge. Here's what they wrote. Translated from French, this slim, beautiful memoir by the 65-year-old François Gravel details his descent into illness and what it feels like to have his body overtaken by an unwelcome intruder. Poetic and provocative, they forgot to mention funny, this worldwide hit will undoubtedly find a similarly robust audience in the US. Worldwide hit? Really? Well, there might be a touch of hyperbole there, but as the publicist at House of Anansi said, we'll take it. So I'm happy to take questions from people at home or people in the room.